give the floor to Daniel.
Scott, Freddy.
Mr. Speaker, as we approach the height of the worst crisis of the capitalist system since it achieved preeminence and dominance of Western liberal democratic systems, as the people of Greece, right now, as I give this speech, are on the streets of Athens begging for handouts. Live lives so disconnected from wealthy bankers that they barely recognise living in the same state as one another.
Hear, hear.
As the unproductive leech of the banking sector teeters on the brink of total collapse, I feel justified in saying to you today, Mr. Speaker, that markets do not solve. Unapologetically, there is going to be a reasonably lengthy setup in this debate as to the terms and parameters of what we are arguing for and what the comparison will be. This will take a minute or so from when I finish outlining my points. The first however, will be that the existence of a powerful Marxist movement, whether taking over overall control or at least being a very substantial influence within a Western democracy, is a necessary precondition to the meaningful protection of the political interests and economic rights of the poor working class majority and for any sensible conception of justice to be realised. The second point I am going to make is why it's necessary to have a left challenge in a political system to sensibly hold capitalism to account, and that without that you get exactly the kinds of failure in a capitalist system that have occurred. Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. We do not necessarily argue for total Marxist revolution in every country around the world right now. Well, if it occurred, we would be prepared to argue that that would be a good thing. However, that we can also defend a more limited conception where communist and Marxist parties make up substantial representation within parliament in countries like Italy, like Greece, like France, like Germany, like the United Kingdom, and God help us, in the United States and Singapore. The burden that we set for ourselves today is that if these movements, rather than dying a slow, strangled death throughout the McCarthyite witch hunt in the United States and throughout the prevailing Thatcherite consensus funded by the love of discovering oil in the North Sea, ladies and gentlemen, that if those movements had not died out as influences, the world would, on a comparative, be a better place. That is the burden we set for ourselves. Opposition will have to defeat that. Starting with my first point, which is why we say the existence of these powerful Marxist movements, whether fully in government or as important political parties in coalition or challenging in opposition, or forming ideas, are a necessary precondition for the meaningful protection of workers' rights. Recognise, Mr. Speaker, that the current political domination of discourse by a Thatcherite consensus, including Mr. Tony Blair, who was essentially carrying on the project by his Tory predecessors of taking away any meaningful representation for true leftist views, for taking away any radical movement of the trade union being recognised or implemented in terms of policy. What you get is a situation where none of the people who are poor and have these class or political interests to be vindicated are ever even able to vote for an interest or for a party which truly represents their views, and the continuing political elite simply dominate and exclude that kind of discourse from being talked about. If you look for an example, if you look at presidential debates in the United States, the issue of NAFTA is never raised, despite the fact that that free trade agreement clearly has a decisive impact, a clear and important impact on the poorest people in America. It's true free trade might have some capitalist benefits for the system, but it's also true that there are clearly meaningful impacts on poor people, at the very least in the short term. The fact that those sorts of issues are not even discussed in the status quo, and that the political elites keep that out of the system, is a shocking indictment of the reality of the absence of leftist movements from governments, and it means that, for example, in the status quo in the United Kingdom, you have the ludicrous situation where even the supposedly left-wing Labour Party doesn't argue that massive cuts in spending aren't necessary, it merely haggles over the amount. Harish.
by and large, in the vast majority of systems, we don't think a Marxist party would get many votes. The result is instead, when you have strong Marxist ideologies, people take to extra systemic feats like violence, exactly what happens in Italy. Look, for instance,
I'll take that on the chin. Even if I'm wrong about it being diverted through a political system, even if I can't caveat that through first proposition, which I would like to do, I would still argue, and I'm prepared to maintain, that that kind of violent movement, in its impact on discourse and preventing the shutting out of those arguments of the system, is much better than the alternative, where we simply go off to vote for parties in British elections in which we accept that essentially we're going to get a cut of 100 billion or 105 billion, and we don't argue that we should basically abandon this kind of capitalist ideology and completely reform the kind of structure that we have in favour of poor people. We say that it is better to have that argument realised. But also what we say, and it leads on from that point, is that essentially without those movements, whether violent or through non-violent means, there is no rallying point for these kinds of political discourses to ever gather together. What might be called in Marxist ideology false consciousness prevails. And this is the reality as to why you get a load of poor people who shouldn't really be voting Tory because it's not in their interest, voting for the Conservative Party. It simply means that they never properly understand their class interest, and they're never able to vote to vindicate those economic interests, and they're never taken into account in the political system. A group of elites simply continue to dominate. We say that is unfair because every human being has agency, should be recognised, from each according to his ability and each according to his needs. That is something that can never happen under a system where Marxists have died away as a substantial political force. Secondly, holding capitalism to account. The lack of a left-based challenge, we would argue, to the capitalist system has created exactly the world in which this financial crisis can occur, and the shuddering arrogance of bankers who believe they can continue to claim million-pound bonuses when their banks have crashed the economy. It is sickening, ladies and gentlemen, that that kind of argument is never being fully articulated. Even the Labour Party thinks Stephen Hester should be remunerated for hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, even if this particular bonus should not be given up. We say that the only real bulwark against that kind of ideology, the unquestioning belief that capitalist systems and capitalist elites should continue in power, comes from the left, and vaguely leftist parties that have really been co-opted by the right, like the Labour Party, are completely insufficient. For these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I beg to propose.
I thank Daniel for his speech, and I'll call for Stephen to open the case for the first one.
Greater! Shame!
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Stephen. A lot of you might not know me. I stopped debating when I was 21. I'm going to bring in 3 points. One, how did Marxism actually function in Europe, and why did it actually preclude the advancement of centre-left politics? Secondly, I'm going to contrast it with other systems where there wasn't a Marxist ideology at play, for example, social democracy in Sweden and Norway, and how they actually got more social democratic aims implemented. And thirdly, I'm going to finish with some stuff on why Marxism is bad, but we think that's less relevant than how Marxism actually functioned in Europe, which is going to be the main focus of our case. First is some refutation. First idea, the main premise of that case, is the West would be more Marxist if we had more Marxist parties. Why did Marxism die out? The main question the judges need to ask themselves. It's because it was functionally inefficient at achieving the goals of the left within Europe. There were financial crises similar to this one in the 60s and 70s in Europe that were mainly caused as a consequence of centre-left parties implementing semi-Marxist ideology in a Keynesian way that actually destroyed them in the long run. Have that kind of financial system functioning actually achieved more left policies in the long run. We're agnostic as to whether left policies are something that we ought to aim towards. It begs the question why left is optimum, and they need to do a lot more work to justify that. But even if we were to accept it, we don't think they achieve that outcome. Second point of refutation, most of it's going to be rolled in, is that NAFTA isn't discussed. CF, all US primaries, it's discussed all the time. Secondly, the reason it's continued to be implemented is it makes more people richer, which is why the average US shopper's shopping basket has gone down by over 10% over the last 10 years, mainly due to trade with other countries in the NAFTA region. It made people wealthier. Third point of refutation is that poor people vote Tory because they don't understand things. Well, why will they understand things now? They don't provide us any causal link. But moreover, and more importantly, people don't just vote based on economic reasons. They vote for ideological reasons. They don't want to live in a country where aspiration is denied. They don't want to live in a country where they don't have the capacity to advance themselves. They like summer holidays. They like giving a better life to their children. They like those options available to them. They also like some social safety net, but that's denied to them by Marxist ideology which demands purity, which is moving on to my first point. How did Marxism actually function in Europe? European Marxism demanded ideological purity from its members. It took on a lot of the intelligentsia that were left-leaning and demanded that they conform to foundational texts. It was almost religious in the way in which it functioned. It had the tenets which are described in the context slide which we are given, which I won't repeat. It demanded that of its members. What did that do to the centre-left? It meant there wasn't really a centre-left. The centre-left atrophied because those who were seen to move more towards the right were castigated as traitors to the Marxist cause. So the right was very successful at ameliorating some of their more extreme tendencies and presenting themselves as more palatable, whereas the left demanded purity and extremism. As a consequence of that, the left did not get into power in Europe, and it denied the left that capacity to do so, particularly under proportional representation systems, but also under first-class vote systems, such as in the United Kingdom. I'm going to talk about some examples of that in a moment. It also tended towards violence, as Harish said. Because it was utopian in its nature, and it demanded the overthrow of the oppressive capitalist systems where your class is being dominated. It led to things like the Red Brigade in Italy, kidnapping the president and demanding ransoms. It led to things, like support for fascists and communists around the world, like the bizarre fetishization of the Russian system, which may well have caused us not to implement the kind of policies we could have done after World War II to try and stop that extreme curve in Russia. No, thank you. Okay, how did it damage the centre-left as a consequence? I think that's pretty clear, because it meant the centre-left didn't exist in the same way that it did in other countries that I'm going to talk about later. I want to give you two case studies of where this happened. The first is the United Kingdom under Labour. Labour, and any centre-left party in Europe, have been very unsuccessful in terms of their percentage of votes. They've only been in power for 27 years out of their existence. I know this, I'm a Labour Party member, I probably tend to agree. Okay. Labour's most successful period, almost half of its entire period in power, was the post-Clause 4 abolition under Tony Blair. Where he said, wanting to take control of the modus operandi of the capitalist economy and take it into state control is no longer going to be an aspiration of the Labour Party. They say that's something that causes us to be right-wing. Well, I'm going to give you three facts that disprove that. First is that we had the greatest investment in education that has occurred over the last 50 years in the United Kingdom. Secondly, we had the most popular tax increase ever introduced, which was the tax increase for the NHS, which had 84% support when it was implemented. These show that we have the capacity to implement centre-left policies when we don't have an anchor of ideology that says we will be Marxist, we will take over and control the system. Jason.
Will you accept that in the last 30 years, the difference between the richest and poorest in this society has got wider? 30 years ago, had some Marxists, now have no Marxists.
I think that's a direct consequence of the fact that the centre-left wasn't in power in this country, whereas it was in other countries. Second point, social democracy in Norway and Sweden specifically disavowing Marxist ideology because they saw the experience of Finland. As a consequence of that, they said, we will go for a third way where we want a level of social democracy, but we don't want the extreme ideological bulwark and anchor of Marxism. As a direct consequence of that, those countries, Jason, have much lower inequality. Those countries have much better health and education systems. Those countries have things like maternal care and child care for people. That's as a consequence of not having the baggage of ideology around their neck. It's saying, we're not going to be Marxists, we're not going to scare the electorate and say, we want to do radically extreme things. What we are going to say is that we want to have a sensible centre-left. People were denied that option in the countries they wanted to talk about, like Italy. And as a consequence of that, people suffered. I want to finish by talking briefly about what true class solidarity is and why Marxism is bad. Because Marxism created false divisions between the different classes, as a direct consequence of that, it led to what a Tory invented in Israeli called the two nations. It was labour versus capital. As a consequence of that, it eroded social solidarity between the two classes, where they were directed towards seeing themselves as being in opposition with one another. We know that for social welfare systems to function adequately, we need solidarity, where people need to empathise with other individuals within that community, within that society. That's meaningfully eradicated, where the rhetoric of one side continuously says, you are the oppressor, where it says, you, Mr. Evil Banker, are somebody that I despise. As a consequence of that, Mr. Evil Banker, he doesn't want to pay tax. And as a consequence of that, the centre-left aims which they premise their case on are not implemented. This is a case where we're ambivalent about whether centre-left is better, but that's their premise. If they want to achieve that premise, they would do well to abandon the anchor of ideology and embrace the pragmatism of what is possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen, for that speech, and call on Lewis to continue the case for the first proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about the importance in an academic sense of having a strong anti-ideology. The effects of other ideologies, the effects of the types of people who study these ideologies, and the moderating effect it has, and why actually it makes liberalism stronger, conservatism stronger, we have a more robust set of elections where we have strong Marxism. Specifically because of Marx's unique ability to critique things and bend the world in a very unique way. Before that, I want to look at the main ideas that came out from the last speech. One of the major ideas was this issue of popularity and violence. And of course, later we accept that Marxism suffered a series of crushing defeats in the last 30 years. For example, North Sea oil empowering Thatcher with capital. Ruthlessly, people who supported Marxism. By the way, that's something we can also regret. Also, ladies and gentlemen, things like McCarthyism having such huge amounts of power in terms of being able to physically remove academics or proponents of politics, or stopping people from saying that out because of fear of getting prosecuted and thrown in jail. Obviously, that doesn't mean that is an unpopular ideology. That's important to realise. But if you take the logical corollary of that, which is, these people might, instead of trying to use the political system, might use violence. As we said, we're totally happy with actual violence occurring in the name of Marxism if it sparks up a discourse. But this is an incredibly important response. So the question is, has liberalism been responsible for violence? I think it has. Has an ethical foreign policy, something which liberalism has espoused, particularly in Europe and America in the last 10 years, led to 5 wars of intervention? Yes. So obviously, ladies and gentlemen, presumably by your logic, if an ideology is bad and you're happy for it to die out on its propensity to allow particular conflicts to happen, for people to be harmed or violence to occur, liberalism and liberal interventionism, by that very logic, is also problematic. So we think these guys have to deal with that particular issue. But let's deal with the core, ladies and gentlemen. Because we said quite clearly there's an issue of forced consciousness. So even if you buy that Marxism is not popular, okay, the political reasons and the reasons of capital that Thatcherism, for example, was able to manifest and kill of Marxism unfairly. Basically, if you take that logic and apply that logic, obviously, forced consciousness means you get brainwashed into it. So even if we accept, right, that people today wouldn't support a Marxist government, we say the very fact there isn't a Marxist critique is because they've been brainwashed, right? So you can't beg the question. They're saying simply because today is not popular, ergo it's not popular in reality. We say, frankly, that's ridiculous. But here's the important issue in the debate, because they said, well, hang on a second, let's look at the effects on the centre-left. And he literally said, Labour has had a very reforming attitude to government in the last 15 years. Despite ignoring the POI, the white POI, that the Gini coefficient has gone worse under Labour. Despite ignoring that tuition fees were introduced under Labour. Despite ignoring that Labour had been co-opted by the capitalist system to accept the economic prevailing orthodoxy that cuts are inevitable and cuts are acceptable. Despite the little regulation of banks under the watch of Gordon Brown. Despite the fact that Labour were in the pockets of Rupert Murdoch for the past 15 years. I'm sorry, but somehow claim that the centre-left is as pure as it can be and starts working is absolutely ridiculous. Moreover, Daniel quite clearly, I'll take you in a second, quite clearly told you about a mobilising effect that this ideology can have. We say when you have a coherent ideology with intellectual leaders who are able to manifestly argue why they're being tricked by a capitalist system, we say that morale means people stand up for their rights and the poor at least have some sort of coherence when they do try at some of the things like Labour trying to put them out of doing what's in their best interest. Go ahead.
You said you're okay with violence when it sparks discourse. Wasn't the discourse that resulted from violence the McCarthyism which you oppose?
I don't. Could you repeat the POI?
Sure. You said you're okay with violence that sparks discourse. Wasn't the discourse that came about as a consequence of that violence the McCarthyism which you oppose?
No. Because the problem is that McCarthy silenced it in the long run, right? Okay? So that you don't have that effect on discourse because McCarthyism completely killed Marxism, right? What we support is the continual existence of an ideology that can offer a critique, right? So I just don't think that's true. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, no, this is an incredibly important example. What is Labour's probably most successful period in government? Which particular policy pretty much sums up left-wing ideology across the Western world? It's the creation of the NHS. At the height where Marxism was a popular ideology where people were openly espousing. So, I'm sorry, but to somehow say that the left is much better able to actualise people's rights under a system where you don't have Marxism just empirically doesn't work. Last one to hit this issue about Scandinavia, yeah, perhaps if Marxism existed as strongly as it did beforehand, people would be better off, even more, okay? But we don't think it can somehow say because it has a certain level of achievement of rights for people, therefore we cannot regret the fact that we don't have more achievements for people who are poor. So thank you. On to the last of all, this issue about the effect on other ideologies. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, Marxism is quite unique in its way of critiquing the world, right? Very few ideologies critique the world through the lenses of class conflict, for example, or false consciousness. Why is that a unique thing in the political system? For a start, it means other ideologies cannot be complacent and just accept that their narrative of the world is correct. So when these guys say, well, we can have debates about NAFTA, fine, we have debates about NAFTA in a very narrow spectrum. We don't have a debate viewed through the prism of class conflict or indeed historical materialism or any of the specific unique narratives that Marxism can give. That's something that's unique to Marxism, ladies and gentlemen. Why is that important? Because it adds variety and colour to the debates we have. It means we're not just presented with a very bland interpretation of the way the world works. Bear in mind, Marxism isn't just an analysis of like the distribution of economic resources within a society. It can be a critique of international relations. It can be a critique about social relations between people. We say that broad ideology legend is incredibly important and helping us understand and interpret events as opposed to in a very narrow, simplistic sense what liberalism and conservatism, libertarianism offer. It's incredibly important both for those ideologies developing important counter narratives and stressing the fundamental basis of those policies. It's also important for voters to be able to have a meaningful way of analysing policies which don't just go on, well, the banks tell us that we have to cut, the banks tell us that we have to cut, but a little bit. Marxism has a unique prism which we kill by not accepting this validity. So why did we win this debate today, quite clearly? Important strategic decision, right? We told you from the outset that even if you accept that right now these ideologies are not popular, that by itself does not prove that we should not regret it, right? The fact that people are tricked by capitalism into believing it is the right system because of accidental historical fact that capitalism had begun and Marxism didn't does not defeat the proposition. It's for all those reasons we stand here proudly beside the proposition. Thank you.
NHS. To continue the case for the first opposition team.
I love you, Sal! I love you!
Two arguments. I want to look at what Marxism and the decline of Marxism has done to the right and why that's beneficial. I'll talk about the creation of a post-political biopolitics. Secondly, I want to look at why the uncreated vacuum in the legitimate decision-making processes across the world. Why it meant, for instance, you had a silent and rational centre in plenty of countries where you had many individuals who could have contributed to political discourse ultimately being silenced. That's why I talked a bit about McCarthyism. Firstly, several arguments in response to what we've heard thus far. One, on violence. What this tells you is violence is justified to the degree it ultimately has an end, like, for instance, those liberal interventions. His claim of the end is improved political discourse. But what I'm going to say is violence almost never leads to the kind of political discourses you want. After the assassination of Aldo Moro, you didn't get people saying, well, they have a point. Marxism, communism might be correct. Instead, you have them saying, look at these Marxists, they're incredibly violent individuals. Worse yet, that meant any individual who might be sympathetic from anyone near the centre to Marxism simply no longer believe that movement. Because no one really supports violence. And when you say the Marxist movement is violent, you lose that support overall. That's why you had violence with no end. No thanks. Second, on the centre-left. In the first place, the centre-left by and large did not exist, as Stephen tells you. We think that was hugely harmful because the centre-left is by and large the electable left, which is the one which voters aren't afraid of. And we hear a couple of things in response to that argument. The first thing we hear is the NHS was created at the moment when Marxism was strongest. I'm going to tell you what actually happened. The NHS was created right after World War II, where class solidarity was strongest. That is the exact opposite from Marxism overall, exactly as Stephen tells you. No thanks. Secondly, they say, now you have a centre-left like Labour, that's led to an increase in the Gini coefficient. I assume that's correct. But what I'm going to say in this circumstance is even though that might have increased inequality overall, it did lead to a reduction in absolute poverty. The fact that you had growth doesn't necessarily, may have created some inequality, but that's definitely better than the counterfactual when you might have had the same growth with a right-wing party or a more right-wing conservative party. That would have been worse.
Shame.
The third thing I want to say is in many of these countries you never had a left emerge at all. Look at Italy, for instance. This isn't just about Great Britain. You never had any real substantial challenge to the Christian democratic movement at all. We think that's hugely harmful in terms of allowing an ideological hegemony to exist. That's when the hegemony they want to destroy ultimately is harm when you don't have reasonable opposition to the facts. Then Lewis tells you that it's really useful to the Marxist viewpoint of the existence of Marxist academia. In the first place, the decline of Marxism as the decline of Marxism of Western liberal democracies has not led to being ousted from all of academia. Everyone knows this if you ever study any politics overall. That still exists, and those viewpoints still exist. But no, academic viewpoints never have a great deal of social traction. The vast majority of Marxists in the Cold War era almost certainly couldn't have told you what Marxism meant, couldn't give you a full critique in that circumstance. It wasn't a particularly persuasive worldview to the vast majority of individuals. No thanks. Let's move on and look what happens to the right, and so look what happens in politics overall. What I want to claim is the best kind of political system is when political parties are willing to consider the ideas of other political parties, and you both have a kind of intellectual arbitrage. Why doesn't that happen when you have a strong Marxist party? Because for people on the centre-right, the idea of stealing ideas from the centre-left or the far-left is simply an anathema. It's something which is so wrong, it's something which is so harmful to you. You ultimately never see it. Even when you look at the Tory party right now, it's not as right-wing as it was in the 1980s. It was obviously bad, maybe, under Margaret Thatcher.
Shame!
More central now than it was then. The reason is that they are more willing to take views over from the centre-left and the left overall. At the point we had strong ideological warfare between the Tories and the Labour Party, or the right and the left, you never saw that occur. In the second place, class identity warfare in political parties was really deleterious to those classes. Why? At the point, for instance, where you had Labour, where you had one single party appealing to one single class, you never had genuine competition for members of that class. So, for instance, if you're a middle-class individual in England in the 1970s, you almost had to vote for the Tory party because they're the only ones who represented your class interests. That doesn't lead to genuine competition. It doesn't mean the different parties are competing for votes, so you ultimately don't get policies which are useful for you. That's hugely harmful in terms of benefits individuals overall. Second half.
Alternatively, if there are more poor people who would vote for a Marxist party, then what you have to do as the right-wing party is to appeal to the majority. Where you have a coalescence around the centre of politics, you have to do less work and make less concessions to the poorest in society. Because they
Every single thing Stephen told you about Marxist parties in Western liberal democracies. To put it differently, what he said is they simply would not get that traction. Even if you were poor, you weren't necessarily going to vote for a communist party. You weren't going to vote for a party which came out as incredibly radical overall, and that's why you don't get those changes. So now let's talk about the way in which the delegitimization of decision makers. For example, the United States, which is an extreme case of a general problem mirrored throughout all of Europe. What you saw was a belief that Marxism, because it was an international ideology, could infiltrate each and every state. Marxism, through Comintern and Comintern, was seen as a threat to each and every country, each and every political ideology. Why was that such a problem? Because it created the exact kind of excuse you needed from individuals on the right to try and eliminate any individual on the left at all. McCarthyism is effectively a political ideology which says we must eliminate anyone, whether they're from the left, whether they're far left, or from the centre left, because any single one of them could be a threat to the entire coherence of the system. What is the consequence of that? Several of them. Firstly, you meant lots of legitimate decision makers and good civil servants were ousted from a system. You had a climate of fear which meant people like Lowen Lattimore, a China expert, is thrown out of the State Department because he might have some level of sympathy. More perniciously, it made it very difficult for any politician to simply take even a moderately leftist position. So look, for instance, at foreign policy during the Cold War. Democrats find it really difficult to argue against interventions like the Vietnam War, because if they're going to do so, people are going to call them a Marxist. Exactly why, for instance, some of the strongest advocates for the Vietnam War are meant to be the most socially progressive people, like Lyndon Johnson. He couldn't do anything else, because if he did so, people would have called him Marxist. He lost a lot of political support. The reality then is in politics almost entirely descended to the centre-right, because if you took any other position, the discourse of Marxism would still exist and would be hugely delegitimated. To some degree, that still exists right now. It was far, far stronger then, and it was hugely harmful. Ultimately, if you look at the way Marxism ultimately functioned, it functioned as a violent movement that was harmful for itself, it was harmful overall. It functioned as a movement to delegitimize the centre-left, the only electable left, and the only useful left. And it ultimately led to individuals who could have contributed to political discourse and political outcome being ousted from the system. I'm very happy to oppose.
Thank you, Reed. And now it's time for Fred to open the case for the second proposition T.
Comrades, hasta la victoria siempre. What Marxism does in terms of its analysis of feudalism, collective underdevelopment, undesirable to many other things as well. Secondly, I'm going to say why this hurt the left. It made left-wing political parties worse. It made trade unions, most crucially as well, become self-interested conservative mechanisms. And thirdly, I'm going to tell you why this hurt the political debate, and why the fact that we can call it a class warfare when we say we should tax the 1% more is quite frankly disgusting to the most richest. Three reasons why they are wrong. Marxism retreated, this is in direct response to them, because from the 1980s onwards, we were able to fool consumers in the West with cheap credit. The lawsuit boom basically created the assumption that by borrowing more, we had met our material needs. That was a freaking lie that fell down in 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. So these guys are basically going, we should lie to people by borrowing an awful lot. Secondly, the idea of electing the centre-left, right? What they're saying is it wasn't really the centre-left at that point because they didn't have a spectrum of left-wing views. It just moved everything progressively rightwards, so now you get epically low turnout at general elections across the Western world, right? That was a method of excluding people from political discourse, not bringing people actively in. Thirdly, as well, I looked at this idea of, oh, it was an excuse, McCarthyism, so they just should kind of have given in to saying, yes, Senator McCarthy, I have now and have once been. That was a failure of the Marxist movement to get strong enough, not a failure that said the Marxist movement should never have existed in the first place. Notice the countries that tried greater solidarity with this. When the Conservative Party in the 1950s under Winston Churchill in some deluded moment tried to do the equivalent of McCarthyite witch hunt, because they were so strong the left was able to survive. Because you had they were able to tell him that he was getting his cretinous Tory mind out of control. Right? So all of those points ultimately fall completely on their face. Well, what Marxism does, there are four things it does. Number one, provide an analysis of feudalism. This is so important, largely because the feudal system has rigged the capitalist game from the beginning in providing people with unfair advantages that pre-existed the market society. This is so important in Britain for the simple reason that the Duke of Westminster still gets money off this place, right? Off the land we have built at the moment. Cutting that voice out of the political discourse ignores the fact how the political economy is a rigged game from the very beginning. Cutting that voice out of the political discourse allows people never to debate inheritance seriously at all, and the creation of new feudalism in the United States political system about how Rick Santorum can inherit daddy's money, and that is not part of the free market, that is part of class interest riding over it. Second point that Marxism does as well is it stops the instrumentalization of the individual, right? It sees them as an actual unit of labour, meaning you have a realistic debate about workers' rights rather than pricing them as commodities. Hence the whole debate about NAFTA. Hence the whole debate, for example, about the minimum wage at the moment. When we had a minimum wage rate in this country, it was about where was the lowest we could set it at, not was the highest where we could set it at. That's why Gordon Brown, that freaking liar, decided in 1998 to set it at £3 rather than £5 would actually meet inflationary targets. Thirdly, and most perniciously, the decline of Marxism allowed the right to claim that there are unproductive economic sections in society, right? Reagan's welfare queens, Thatcher's demonisation, right? The reason that comes is that the reason those people are there is because Catalans has to provide welfare in order to buy people off, right? That's what the Marxist analysis can provide. Those people are economic actors. They're just shut out of the system. That is the analysis. You shut out of the system and allow the fact in this country for every politics to coalesce around the idea that they are undesirables, that are unproductive, and ignoring the fact they might have been shut out of the entire economic system from the very beginning. Fourthly, as well, it cuts out the idea of a collective consciousness across humanity. One benign idea that we think the left did that largely would stop the idea of believing that neo-imperialism was the best way to develop the third world. The best way to say that we just need to impose a class in, developing countries that would somehow lift everyone up. That has not been true. That has led to more inequality in the third world through our aid policies. Secondly, why does this hurt the left? 3 reasons. Number 1, when they're in power, they have to radically appease the capitalist system because they don't have to appease the Marxists. This was how the NHS was done, right? In the first place, what happened was you had to do a number of different policies. Some of them didn't work, like the nationalisation of steel. But ultimately, you could sell the steel off for a greater profit. The end of it, we were still left with an NHS. New Labour did absolutely jack shit in terms of building new institutions because they were spending their entire time appeasing the city. Number 2, it made trade unions much more unresponsive, right? Look at the trade union that Rosie belongs to, the 80 They are content to say we should get tax money off those that are paid the least in the private sector to fund our generous pensions because we have become a vested self-interest group. When Marxists were active in trade unions, they were about getting the whole political economy changed, not just carving out their own vested interest. It is no surprise that in Western liberal democracies today, trade unions only exist to defend the public sector. They only exist to defend the vested interests of those that already have jobs. Thirdly, as well, it has radically changed the success calculus of the West. Of the left. Ultimately, it's a good idea you can get affirmative action, but affirmative action is useless without a fundamental redistribution of the underlying causes that mean you have injustice. That is what's been cut out of the debate altogether. Go for it, closing.
Why is it that many people who disagree with Thatcher's policies don't
Don't stress her. The reason why they don't describe themselves as Marxists, sir, is probably because they don't necessarily like the idea of scary hammer and sickles. The difference is, no. The difference is, though, they probably disagree with Thatcher's policy. What's something more than cheap credit thrust upon them? What's something more to meet their material needs than that? That's what Marxists can contribute to their success. They have to be singing the red flag and farting the general from Blackadder in order to necessarily get involved in the anti-Thatcher case. Thirdly, why has this altered the political debate in a horrible way? Number 1, freedom itself has been colonised by the market. Freedom is more than the market, and we need to have it as meaningfully more than the market, because we can't necessarily play all the same rates in the market if we're to believe in an institution. Some will fail, some will lose. That is not the same idea. We need ultimately deeper safety nets than we can ever possibly provide by the idea that saying ultimate freedom is the market. That is not the case. That is not the case at all. Secondly, the whole debate between right and left has been radically moved towards a particular kind of centre that has excluded some types of voters and made others enormously more powerful in the political debate, meaning we have less democracy. We have a democracy that coalesces around those who can afford to buy newspapers every day. We have a democracy that goes around those who can afford to go to debate competitions, and we have a democracy that fails at all us. For all these reasons, comrades, I beg to
Beneath the chain we live and die. For cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. Monday.
Sometime. When Daniel stood up yesterday, what he claimed that he was going to prove is that Marxism is a necessary precondition for the protection of the poor. I'd like to point out that at a strictly logical level, necessity is disproven by the existence of counterexamples. The existence of Nordic countries disproves the
consensus that we have achieved is going to fail. Because what they have to do to win this debate is they have to either tell us that it is in fact a necessity in order to achieve certain ends, such as the protection of the poor, or that there is something that we are simply not getting today. We reject both of these. We think that everything they have argued for is catered for. This has been largely overshadowed on their part because they refuse to engage with any examples that aren't the United Kingdom and its weirdness, but also because they simply don't want to engage with reality. So I'm going to rebut the opening first, then talk to you about I-positive matter, which I will discuss democracy and human rights, which we think is the answer to many of their constraints, and then I'm going to talk about the closing argument. So, I've already talked to you about the false problem of necessity. But they say to us, that without Marxism, there is no rallying point for leftist ideals, something that Fred harps on about a lot. We think that there are a number of problems here. The first is that a lot of this argumentation, as Stephen said to you right at the beginning, begs the question. The fact that Marxism lost a debate in the actual history of the world that happened does not mean that they are right. What it means is that people did choose. They did exist, and we chose not to do them. So when they say to you, the problem in the status quo is that the poor vote for Republicans, we need to respect the fact that in democracies, we recognize that people vote for reasons. Some of those reasons are because they want to have things that they don't get from Marxism. Some of those reasons are because they love competitiveness, right? Poor people in America vote for Republicans. They vote against wealth. We need to recognize this is an expression of their desire, and to simply argue using this fancy terminology of false consciousness that they're brainwashed is to beg the question of this debate, and we reject it. We also reject the notion that there just is no challenge to capitalism as it exists today. We point to you not only to left parties, which do exist, which advocate different policies from right parties, but also to things like the Occupy movement. What is the Occupy movement? It is a non-Marxist, anti-competitive, anti-corruption, anti-inequality movement which is pro-capitalist. Okay? We think the existence of such discourses in society answers a large part of their case. So I think it's really important to point out that a large part of this is the problem that they are not able to provide us with counterfactual. This is evident in Lewis's speech where he stands up and he says, well actually, if I have to be forced to deal with social democracies, I guess what I'd be forced to say is, maybe they'd be a bit better. That's the problem with the Occupy movement. No thank you. So, when they say to us, for instance, then, as a last point of rebuttal to the opening, that Marxism critiques the world in a unique way, and that in fact it allows for other narratives to not be complacent, we say to you that, by the way, Marxism is not unique to, debating is not unique to Marxism, right? The major ideological difference that exists in the United States today, that being the argument between, on the right, either libertarians or social conservatives, and on the left, let's call it, sort of rights-based centre liberals, is a large division. It is a division which will result in things like Medicare, or not in things like Medicare. Those are substantive differences which translate the desires of people into policies. They haven't given us something which says that we ought to discount the fact that those people are thinking individuals who have chosen to engage in politics in this way. That they have chosen to reject Marxism. That will be the reasons why we think this is really important. We're going to talk about your
Joe, what do you think is going to happen to the poor in Scandinavia when peak oil happens and oil runs out because of that oil boom, the reasons boom, runs out in about 50 to 100 years? What do you think will happen to the poor?
I don't know if that factual claim you've made about Scandinavia is correct. Harish is muttering it's a lie, but if this is something which will need to be dealt with by the policies at that time. As exists currently, they have developed an incredibly strong social net which deals with the poor. I would like to believe that when more people become poor, their country will attempt to deal with that in a way which mitigates those harms and then will react as economies do. I think that there's no other answer I can possibly give when they don't have a crystal ball. So let me talk to you about democracy and the benefits that have accrued after the decline of Marxism. Because what does Marxism talk to us about? It says, in fact, three things that we're told on a piece of paper. That there is class conflict in this drive society, that the free market is inherently exploitative, and that we should abolish capitalism. At least the latter two of these are just completely out of touch with the ways in which people engage in today's debate. And therefore, no thank you, there are reasons why we think that this is important. So when we talk about the fact that there is an inherent understanding that capitalism is bad, we think this has been disproven. It's not merely out of touch because people no longer hear about Marxism, it's because what we have seen is from the 60s to the 90s a development of a type of life in Western Europe where quality of life was literally unrivaled in the history of humanity. More people live in greater wealth than have ever lived anywhere in the history of humanity, and we think that this is something which led people to believe that capitalism should give them what they wanted. This is why the debate has shifted towards moving to getting capitalism to have a human face, which is why in reality today we see two versions of left thought that exist in society. The sort of United States Starbucks charity model of capitalism with a human face. On the other hand, the social democracy movements of of Western Europe. What both of these do is they answer the large majority of things that they are worried about. They answer problems of inequality, they answer problems of the capitalist system. They recognize, no thank you guys, that in fact what we can do is we can modify the capitalist system in a manner which leads to us preserving these benefits while still protecting the poor. This is where the debate is, and it is here because what we saw in history, as they told you in opening, is the failure of Marxism to give us this. There are a number of reasons why it's just simply antithetical to democracy. These reasons are that Marxism is totalizing. It says that there is a right answer, and it pushes that aggressively. It is uncompromising. It argues, ex hypothesi, by the way, because we have a piece of paper that tells us this. It argues for the abolition of capitalism. That is something that they simply cannot run away from, and means that these parties were uncompromising in the realm of this debate. It advocates overthrow. This is the reason that it was rejected, because it was too extreme. What benefits did we accrue without it? We move towards the centre. Parties which are closer to one another are able to engage in more rational debate because they have more common ground between them. They're able to discuss whether policy differences are merely differences of interpretation and differences of rollout, or whether they are deep ideological differences. They're able to translate that to the public through public engagement in manners which those people are able to engage with. That means that they're more able to progress. Secondly, critiques of capitalism that exist now, such as through the Occupy movement, but especially through human rights discourses, plug into feelings that people have in a much more direct way than capitalism. Marxism. Instead of constructing this artificial notion of class consciousness, class conflict, etc., what we just told is that we should value people as people, and therefore we should mitigate against harm and suffering. We think that this is a much more natural way of dealing with people. We think it has been massively successful. We think that as history has unfolded, it has solved for a large number of the problems that they have seen. It has solved for them in Western Europe, it has solved for them on the continent, if not on this muddy island. And for all of these reasons, we are happy to vote.
Joe and applause for Jason to summarize the debate from the second proposition side.
ESU.
And ESB.
Grandpa, we love you.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the reality in which we find ourselves means that the tools of social change and the medium of social discourse is wholly inadequate to solving the problems which we face within our society. Everything that we hear from that side of the house, everything you read in the newspapers, everything you see on the news, is about how we make small, granular changes to the inequalities which currently exist. Is it a small percentage more or a small percentage less? Is it a few more schools? Is it an academy? Or is it a state comprehensive? What Marxism does as a force in the political discourse is it requires fundamental change and re-examination. Yes, it is an uncompromising force, and what it forces is concessions from the right and from the status quo. So a few points of very brief rebuttal. We had this whole chat about the Nordic country, and apparently the counterexample to the failure is that there are Nordic countries and that they're really nice to their people. What Marxism does is Marxism examines the feudal underpinnings, as Fred brought you, about the inequalities of the capitalist system. Marxism engages in the idea that the reason that capitalism is unequal now is because it was always unequal. If you look at Nordic history and you look at the societal structures and you look at the fact that there was not entrenched capitalism, what you had was more equal societies to begin with. You had an infinitesimally small aristocracy which was eliminated. If you want to see why they are now more equal under a capitalist system, it is because they were more equal to begin with. Only Marxism is willing to take the step to make that fundamental change in the flawed capitalist paradigm in which we currently exist. We heard that apparently LBJ wanted to be a moderate. He wanted to shift to the left but couldn't because of the pernicious influence of the evil Marxists, and people would call him a Marxist. If that logic is true, if that is actually the case, then why is it that politics here and now, where there is no Marxist influence, is even more forced to the centre, ladies and gentlemen? What we require is a counter-voice and a counterpoint. The idea that the Occupy Wall Street as a non-political movement can provide this, according to Joe, is a movement that is not running for political office, that does not seek election, that is not in the boardrooms, and is not the uncompromising force that defends the right of the downtrodden left, ladies and gentlemen. It is an abject nonsense. So Marxism, as a force, is unique. It is unique in the way it examines problems, it is unique in the way that it looks at the world. Because at the moment, all equality and all injustice which we try and deal with is with the existing inequalities with which we are faced. Fred brought you a further example when we look out with the country we are currently in, when we look at the Marxist perception of people as individuals in a global context. What the capitalist system says to you is that the way to solve poverty in other parts of the world, stay standing, I'll take you in a minute, is to give them money and give them a little bit of aid. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that this is flawed. We have seen, if we look at the African continent, how this has failed people for the last 30 and 40 and 50 years. Marxism requires a re-examination of the capitalist approach. It requires an appreciation of people as individuals, and we say that it is a better choice and a better way of saving people, sir.
Let's be honest, people rejected Marxism the first time around.
Okay.
Can you give us any mechanism through which this lovely critique is likely to have any meaningful impact on
So, the reason, ladies and gentlemen, people apparently rejected Marxism is, as Fred has pointed out, because everybody has been lied to time and again. What the capitalist world gave you was two things. It gave you cheap credit, continually, indefinitely, to fulfill all of your consumer needs. It was willing to exploit the world and drag resources in so that the standard of living was pushed up, so people stopped questioning what was going on. But this is not sustainable. Not only is it exploitative and immoral on a global scale, ladies and gentlemen, it is also something, as we've seen from the economic crash, that has not come about. That cannot last forever. The second thing which the capitalist system did is it gave benefits and handouts on a colossal scale. What it did was it turned around and it said, we will use the money of the state, look over here, shiny, shiny benefit, don't look over here, colossal injustice. Now we then have from this side of the house the idea that the NHS, and apparently it came about during a time of great class cohesion within this country. That's a lie we tell school children because we can't explain to them about how the political infrastructure works because they're only 15, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that the change which brought about the introduction of the NHS was the first realisation of the power of the left, when people realised that the state had a moral obligation to its citizens and the power to effect social change on a scale that individuals simply could not. What we have seen since then is the power of the left was at its height then, when Marxism was there, when it was part of the discourse, and when, as we've brought you all down this table, Marxism as part of the political discourse forces concessions. When you have a voice there, which is on the far left, which is saying, actually no, we think the minimum wage should be £50 an hour. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that rights for individual is not just about saying that we should change the law and say that women should be paid the same. It's not about saying that a legislative change which has not brought about real change in society because women are still massively underpaid. It is about having a voice and a force in politics which is willing to press the government, to keep pressing the government, to force pressing the government, to campaign and lobby for real and actual change for its people, because that is what it believes. Because it is utterly uncompromising. Because the ideology of Marxism is that everybody deserves things from and of the state, and the state is the tool by which people's happiness is realised. And we think that their force within politics as a way to create a new discussion and a new discourse is absolutely paramount. What we see under the status quo is a world where we have moved towards the centre of politics, towards consensus politics, where there is no clear blue water, where we have no real political change and we have no real political discussion. We see trade unions failing to actually defend the interests of their members. We see the minimum wage being introduced at a paltry level. We see apparently a left-wing government introducing tuition fees, which is going to rob the next generation of the poorest students of the chance of their education, ladies and gentlemen. We attend on this side of the house that these things simply would not have been possible with the voice of Marxism shouting from the halls of Westminster and from the streets of London that this is not acceptable, that this is not something which should be done to the people. We believe that Marxism has a unique way of viewing the world. It acknowledges that society is massively unfair and has been massively unfair, but it doesn't think that it is possible to have small piecemeal change by the people already within that society. It realises that you have to look out with that. You have to look at the underlying injustice. Those have to be fundamentally changed. Mr. Speaker, Marxism is a force for change. It is a force for discussion. And it is a force which we desperately need here and now, and that is why we win.
Viva comunismo en la libertad. No, it's Italian from the spotlight. It's Italian equivalent of the other two. Traitor. Why are you wearing that?
He's from Pembroke. Oh, really? Pembroke.
What do you know about the poor?
Okay, I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, what do people really like? Why Marxism assumes a vision of human nature which isn't true, that's why it's always going to fail. Secondly, what the benefits is actually going to create, because we think a counterfactual they created basically was wrong. Firstly, what do people really like? No. A lot of what we just heard in that last speech was just basically him shouting, we should help poor people. We agree. A lot of him was just shouting, capitalism is sometimes flawed. We agree. These are A, moral intuitions, B, trivially, factually true, right? He needs to argue for a lot more than just that, right? The problem with Marxism is that ideology, as they demonstrated, that can only ever be shouted. It cannot be rationally activated. Marxism says, by definition, everything is class conflict. If you're arguing against it, you are the oppressor. If you're arguing for it, you're the oppressor. If you're arguing against it, you're the oppressor. If you're arguing for it, you are part of the oppressed, right? That is not the reality we live in. Why? Because human nature says, and we kept telling them this and they never came back with this, that no, that people are aspirational in nature, right? I can be poor and still want to enter a competitive system where I can be better than other people. Thank you. Marxism systemically denies me this possibility. No, thank you. In the real history of Marxism, in those non-liberal Western countries which tried to put it in place, the people who suffered the most were the farmers, or the people who were the poorest in society, because what they worked for was taken away from them, and they abhorred that. Unless they are positing that people in the USSR are somehow just fundamentally different from people in Western liberal democracies. People in Western liberal democracies will abhor that too. But you know what, guys? No. Guess what? That's why Marxism actually lost the debate. The entire approach in this debate was to say, let's imagine a counterfactual where Marxist claims were persuasive. But you can't make that because they won't, right? In the real world, they lost everything. Here to prove that there was some other factor. That other factor was capitalism was deceiving us. Basically, they just described some things about capitalism and called that deception. Right? That's what they said. Look, there was lots of credit, there was too much credit, that was deception. No, that was people borrowing too much. You didn't need a bunch of Marxists to point out that borrowing too much was bad, right? Like, many people should have, like in the 1980s, there was there was a big economics movement in Cambridge that was pointing out this borrowing would be very bad in the long term, right? A bunch of crazy Marxists say, don't borrow because this is an oppressive capitalistic system. It alienated everyone ever buying into that claim, right? That's why it's so important when Joe tells you, thank you. The problem with Marxism is that it grates against what we as human beings want for us. That's why Occupy Wall Street is such a better alternative. Because it acknowledges that, yes, we need a system where you can benefit according to what you can do, right? Where competition is a good thing, thank you. And you will take your property away from you and redistribute it. Because no, Marxism just isn't about helping the poor, it's about taking away all the property that they earn as well and redistributing it by some means, to which they have no say at all. People tend not to like that, right? But what these other movements do is appeal to a moral intuition, thank you, in a much more realistic way by saying, yes, we acknowledge we should help the people who are hugely poor. We acknowledge that's a huge thing. There are many problems with capitalism. That doesn't mean we should get rid of it altogether, right? Because I'm like shouting something just alienates. So I'll take it closer.
Alright, okay. Look, if this was a game of football, Marxism didn't lose because it didn't score enough goals. It was because cheap credit and welfare dependency moved the goalposts.
Marxism would have just left the goalposts there, or possibly pushed them further away from the playing field. A, massively alienated everyone. B, wouldn't have actually done anything to change the reality that there was credit and people could tell us it was wrong anyway, right? I mean, there are other people who are pointing out the goalposts off the field. If the goalposts are off the field, it tends to be fairly obvious, right? Like, many people who are not Marxists can point that out as something probably wrong, right? You didn't need Marxism to help us do that, right? To tell you the basic understanding of why Marxism in this straight counterfactual work is wrong, because basically people are never going to buy into it, because people are aspirating. Right? Okay, second point, what are the real benefits? We told you, and this is our extension, that any democracy needs a reasonable middle ground and people can buy into competing philosophies of the moral good, right? Marxism doesn't give you any latitude for that reasonable debate.
debate. It doesn't give a reasonable debate, and what it therefore creates is, even if these Marxist movements could create policies, they'd be incredibly short-termist. They wouldn't answer anything more than one government, because everyone who just hated this government would have voted them out. Like we eventually did to Margaret Thatcher, right? We asked them, why did Margaret Thatcher describe herself as Marxist? Hammer and sickle, right? That was a real thing which happened. What they tell us, they told us that, well, McCarthyism was an example of the failure of the Marxist system, the Marxist movement to be good. Okay, it was a failure, they concede that. What we're telling you is a systemic and inherent failure of Marxism, because it will always fail, because what we told you about human nature. So I mean, we said, we need Marxism to point out that feudalism is a bad thing. No. Guys, like most people on the street who can describe feudalism to, we think that's a bad thing without Marxism using an uncompromising stance, right? You need to prove to us, no thank you, why making the leap from people inheriting wealth is bad to let's therefore get rid of all capitalism would have appealed to people on the ground, right? No thank you. And along this entire bench, we saw no proof as to why these claims would actually be persuasive to real people as opposed to basically academics, right? No thank you. Right, that's why that claim wouldn't work as well, right? Like, we can have reasonable debates about getting rid of inheritance laws or preventing people from inheriting stuff without needing a Marxist perspective, right? No thank you, right? Then they said, well, you know what, Marxism hurt the left. Well, because we then have to appease these capitalist policies. Again, premised on the notion that Marxism would actually have done anything to change that fact, right? Furthermore, they said that the reason the Nordic countries is an irrelevant example is because they never had aristocracies. No, that's nonsense. The Nordic countries were some of the earliest countries historically to develop monarchies and extensive like systems of aristocracy. Like Shakespeare wrote Hamlet at the time and made Hamlet a Nordic prince because they actually existed and everyone even then knew about it, right? So that was nonsense. Also, the thing about oil, Sweden has no oil, not true, right? Well, right? Then they said, well, let's bring aid into the picture. Guys, like everyone acknowledges, even the UN acknowledges that the West aid policies are a huge failure without having to point out, solution, get rid of all capitalism. Right? Like, that's just crazy. W.S. Moyo can write an excellent critique of our current developmental aid strategies, why all like checks and balances are bad, without having to abolish the capitalist system. The claim they had to prove fundamentally was that Marxism is persuasive to individual people, because that was fundamental to Marxism, A, having any effect in the real world in this counterfactual, and B, being actually able to make people's lives better as a result of that. That was never proven, because you remove the democratic middle ground, will never buy into it. We are proud to oppose.